Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Welcome to our annual lecture dinner. At last year's lecture, our distinguished speaker, who told us how cooking made us humans, was a renowned anthropologist. Our speaker tonight, Dr. Nathan Meerwald, is a man of so many disciplines and accomplishments you might think we were being addressed by a group of different experts all at the same time. He is a computer scientist, a mathematician, a physicist, who gained his postdoctoral fellowship at Cambridge working under Stephen Hawking, looking at the, was it the curved space and quantum mechanics?
Quantum theories of space and time.
Right. Studying cosmology and quantum field theory. An economist, a paleontologist, formerly chief technology officer at Microsoft, and currently an entrepreneur. As if all these things weren't enough, he's also a lover and trained chef, and an accomplished photographer. And he probably has other areas of advanced expertise that we just don't know about yet. He's here tonight, however, because he shares one thing with all of us in this room, a love of food. And he wants to understand everything about it that he can. Luckily for us, he's put his unique and varied expertise into creating what will surely be regarded as one of the most important books ever published on the subject. 6 volumes, you see in front of you, of Modernist Cuisine, the Art and Science of Cooking. This extraordinary work involved a large team of chefs, scientists, writers, visual artists, and editors that could only have been assembled via the zeal and the dedication of this one man. Dr. Meerwald says in the book that a saner man would not have done what he did, and we can only be grateful that sanity, in this instance anyway, did not prevail. We feel extremely privileged to have him here, and without further ado, I want you to hand the stage over to the speaker for the Guild of Food Writers 2011 lecture, Dr. Nathan Meerwald.
Well, Mike? Sure. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about our project. So there's lots of books on cooking technique. Here's just a few examples of books that will show you step by step a whole bunch of classic cooking techniques. But only the classic cooking techniques. You'd be very hard pressed to find anything in any of these books or any other classic step-by-step sort of book that's younger than about 30 years old, and even that's pushing it. Most of what you find are the real classics. And the set of books I chose for this picture are about French or other sort of high-end Western cuisine, but if you picked Italian food or you picked Chinese food, you could find another set of these big books. But again, it's the classic techniques that would be covered. Now, there's also some great books on the science of cooking. Harold McGee's book, for example, which sort of really started the whole idea of science in the kitchen being relevant to a broad audience, as well as a variety of others. So there's some great books on that, but they tell you only in a very academic sense about science and cooking. They aren't intended to be practical. There aren't recipes or cooking techniques in them. There's also some great books which are about single specific techniques. Here's a couple on sous vide, one by a Victor Stamfer, a German book, Thomas Keller's Under Pressure, Cocina al Vacío, also called just sous vide, by Joan Roca. Those books will illustrate a particular modern technique very well, but what about all the other ones? Sous vide is just one of them, and in fact, even with sous vide, they only cover it to a small extent. Finally, there's some big books by modernist chefs, Grand Achatz of Alinea, a whole series of books by Ferran Adria at El Bulli, the Big Fat Duck Cookbook, and the Not Quite So Big Fat Duck Cookbook. But these are each, as they should be, they're by a chef who explains his particular culinary vision. And frankly, even as big as they are, they don't have the page budget to explain all of the techniques and take you by the hand. Some of these books are best if you actually already know how to do the techniques, then you may pick up the subtleties of how a specific chef does it. So I realized all this a few years ago, because I was trying to learn all of the state-of-the-art cooking techniques myself, and it was hard. And it was hard because unnecessary information was scattered all over the place. A particular kitchen would know a few things, another kitchen would know another couple of ideas. Some food scientists would have this fact or that fact. So the boy, it'd be great if you could put them all together in one spot to make them easier to learn. So we did, and that's what the project started out to be. It's 5 hardcover volumes and a 6th volume that's a kitchen manual. So in here, we've tried to cover a bunch of things that are much broader than a cookbook normally does. You know, cookbooks are really usually recipe books, or a collection of recipes. A few books, like those ones I showed earlier, are a technique book. That will say, in addition to recipes, will show you the real techniques of how you would do things. So there's also books like that. Then there are books that talk about science and so forth, as we described. We decided that you had to do it all together. That simply giving a recipe for some of these new techniques wasn't enough, because it wouldn't give you the necessary insight to understand why you were doing it that way. And if the technique is new enough and different enough, the intuition you may have developed from traditional cooking would fail you in trying to apply it to the new technique. So we have a tremendous amount of both diagrams. We also wanted to show the world a vision of cooking in photographs that they hadn't seen before. And that's because we didn't want this book to only be for professionals. We wanted this to be for anyone who is both passionate and curious about cooking. If you're only one or the other, this is not the set of books for you. But if you're both passionate and curious about it, then we've got a lot for you. But to really make that accessible, we decided we would use dramatic photographs to try to get people engaged, to try to seduce them into material they might have otherwise thought would be a little off-putting. So here's some fun facts about the book. 6 volumes, 2,438 pages, 1.1 million words. If you stretch them all out in a single line of text, it would be 12.5 kilometers long. I'm not sure why you'd want to do that, but it's kind of a cool statistic. We took 150,000 pictures for the book, and 3,200 of them were actually good. So we put them in the book. 1,522 recipes, give or take, which came from 72 of the best chefs in the world, as well as recipes we developed ourselves. 6 research cooks, 44 writers, editors, and art staff cumulatively over the project. 20 kilograms unpacked. My favorite statistic, 2 kilograms of ink in a single copy. You know, the printers make a blank book for you. And I said, well, the book me like this. They said, well, there's the weight of the ink. And I said, yeah, right. I said, no, it'll be about 2 kilograms. It was an amazing process putting it together. I made the first outline about 5 years ago, and worked on the book basically alone for the first couple of years, and decided it would take forever, so that I hired up a whole team of people. Because a project like this can't just have a single voice. This is more like building a reference work or an encyclopedia, where you really need a whole staff of talented people. Art directors, researchers, fact checkers, our research chefs, and well, we all came together to make this book. The book's big, and we tried to do a lot of things to make the book as a physical object interesting, including the kitchen manual, which is made so you can fold it back on itself, and it's printed on waterproof, washable paper. That's because we thought the main book was probably too big and too pretty to take into the kitchen. So all the principal recipes from the book are printed a second time in here. So you can take this into the kitchen and get it dirty. One of the questions I'm always asked is, because I have a background in technology, how come I did a book at all? Right? Why isn't this something that's online or an e-book? And so this was our picture we took to try to show that. This is one of our cutaway photos in the book. And look how amazingly small it is on an iPad. And then, of course, you can't read the captions. So, you know, the reality of the situation is we decided what our first delivery vehicle, our first platform in computer speak would be 2 years ago, before there was an iPad. So there wasn't any question of doing it. Of course, on Kindle, in black and white, tiny like this, it would make no sense at all. So then we're often asked, well, are you going to have an iPad version? And someday I'm sure we will, but no time soon, because frankly, a physical paper book is actually the best way of delivering this kind of information to the set of people who would like it most, which is people in the kitchen. The resolution, the quality of the photos, all of these things are actually superior in paper. So someday we'll do that, but not right away. We did a bunch of things to try to make sure the book was very high quality. You know, ordinary halftones are 175 lines. Art books are typically 200 lines. We use a technology called stochastic printing, which winds up having enormously better resolution, because we thought, I might as well. In fact, the interesting thing is, even though ebooks are all the rage to talk about, there's never been a better time to make a paper book, because there's technology like this available that lets you print a paper book with higher fidelity than ever before in the past. This is the gamut. It's the range of colors you can print in an ordinary set of inks is over here, where the gray shows colors that can't be printed. You're not normally aware of this, but in fact, if you think about it, how could you ever print a color that isn't in your set of inks? Well, it turns out there's something called chromocentric inks, and with those we could print a vastly larger set of colors than we could with conventional inks. Now, one of the things that we really wanted to do was to create a lot of reference tables, and so I'm going to focus at first on this one for two reasons. This is our custard table. So as you know, when you make a custard, you take egg. In this case, it's whole egg. In this case, it's egg yolk. And you dilute it with liquid. And here's the dilution percentages down the side. Well, then you can also cook it at various temperatures. And of course, if you've got more egg, it'll in general have a firmer texture. But also, if you cook it hotter, it'll be more. So if you had more egg, but you lowered the temperature, you'd get the same texture. So we did an enormous series of experiments to give what we thought were a bunch of guidelines on what the texture would be. And I'm often asked what modernist cooking is about, and is it about using lots of weird ingredients or special equipment? And so I come back to explain this custard table, because I call this modernist attitude. Okay, Auguste Escoffier could have made this table. There's nothing on here that requires technology other than a bain-marie and a thermometer. But it's as a point of our attitude, we decided, look, we ought to have something that goes and once and for all maps this out, is then a guideline for people to use. You can use it as a reference. And then a chef, whether they're a home chef or they're a professional chef, can use this as a point of departure. So no, it's not all about xanthan gum and liquid nitrogen, although we love those. It's also about doing things like this to create a reference work that people can use for hopefully a long period of time. We have lots of step-by-step techniques. Here's one of our more interesting and controversial ones. First of all, we have a chapter on wine. Most cookbooks don't. And in fact, most cooks treat wine like it's sort of a religious thing. It's got a whole set of principles that are not to be messed with at your peril. You know, God may strike you dead. Our view is, in fact, that we wanted to sort of demystify that. So our chapter on wine discusses a variety of modern looks at wine. Here's one of them. Classical decanters have a large surface area inside, and you pour the wine either through a device like this, or you pour it carefully, so you get the wine to sheet on the inside. That exposes the wine to the air in the decanter. It does two things. Gas is dissolved in the wine, some of which you don't want will come out of solution when you do that. Oxygen will come in. Well, if you can do that, why not do this? This is called hyperdecanting. You pour the wine into a blender and you hit frappe. And you do this at the table. And there are two reasons to do this. And the first and main reason is the look on people's face when you do it. Because what a real wine expert will be so horrified. I did this once for one of the top winemakers in Spain. he's a Spanish duke. I thought he was going to pull out a sword and run me through, but I did this to his wife. Then we had a blind taste test, and he picked the one that had been in the blender. At which point, he completely didn't believe me, so we had to do a second bottle where he watched us pour it because he thought we swapped it in the back. And the second time, he still preferred the blended wine. Now, you wouldn't do this with a very old wine, but a young red wine, anything that would benefit from decanting, pretty much will benefit from this. We're also big, sorry you can't see this very well, but we're big on something we call parametric recipes. So many cookbooks have what they call a master recipe. They'll have a master recipe for a dish, then we'll have variations. Well, we had so many master recipes that we sort of turned the master recipe thing inside out. So we have the set of steps, in this case this is about making stocks. And then we have all of the proportions, those are the parameters that go in. So a single spread like this can summarize many, many different recipes. In this case, it's stocks. We've got roughly 30 recipes in the book for stocks, jus, broths, bouillons, consommes, where we've done lots of exhaustive experiments to come up with what at least our favorite set of both the techniques for creating them and the proportions. We also have what we call example recipes. So once you do a specific, one of these tables that give you the overall picture, it's still nice to focus in. And again, I'm sorry you can't read this perfectly, but this is a hot quince gel. Here's an orange gel, banana, and green apple. So in those cases, we picked some fruits that all had some different properties to them. You know, of course, in the case of quince, you have to cook it quite hard up front, or you're not going to be able to puree it, and the flavor will be very tannic. Very different than what you'd have to do with banana, for example. So this set of example recipes explains the range of things that you'd apply the technique to. They're typically not a full dish. You wouldn't serve a whole plate full of hot orange gel, but you might use it in another context. Finally, we have what we call plated dish recipes. There's one of these whole volumes. Volume 5 is plated dish recipes. And this is the only part of the book that's really like a conventional cookbook, because it has, you know, a conventional cookbook has a nice big picture of the food, then it's got the recipe. But here we try to integrate it with the rest of the book, so we have what we call the dashboard here. This is the mise en place and the order of preparation that tells you all the other parts of the book where you might need a stock recipe, for example, or something else. And then it goes on to show the rest. One of our dramatic features of the book is what we call the cutaway photo. And what I wanted to do here was to give the magic view inside your pots and pans and equipment. What's going on when you cook? And I thought about doing diagrams, but ultimately I thought, you know, it'd be much better to show people directly. So we created these set of cutaway photos. In this case, it's a traditional pot roast. We have a pork roast in there. When braises started, braising was typically done with heat actually from above and below. In this case, coals below and coals above, so you'd have a little bit of the infrared heating from the top. Then each of these captions around here explains what's going on. And explains it in both a scientific way, but hopefully a very accessible scientific way. To say, hey, the reason, you know, there's drops forming off the top. There's infrared rays coming from this that's going to create a brown crust on the top. Now, people ask, how'd you do those cutaways? And this is how. We have a machine shop. And the way, may come as a great surprise, the way you do these cutaways is you cut things in half. People think that there's a trick to it, but no, in fact, you just cut lots of things in half. In some cases, here you can see a pot. See this red stuff here? We have glued a piece of heat-resistant glass in front with this red cement. Now, then what we would do to take the photograph, or to make the final photograph, is we'd remove evidence of that red cement. This is a little bit like Hollywood movies where someone flies through the air supported by a wire, and then you usually take the wire out and you're just flying. So I like to say we have two halves of one of the best kitchens in the world. Here's one of our dramatic cutaways. This is a cutaway of home grill showing making hamburgers. Now in this case, there's no glass glued here. So it's another one of the interesting things about cutaways. Don't try this at home because it's dangerous and messy. So like these coals kept falling off the edge here because there's nothing to hold them in. So you have to have someone beneath there with a pair of tongs putting them back. But if you're willing to make a hell of a mess, you can take an awesome photograph. We also did a variety of other things that are somewhat counterintuitive or different. In this case, I did computer modeling to just say, how does heat fall off as you move away from a fire? So if I've got fire down here all the way, how far do I have to move away to have it down by 10% or down by 50%? But there's also, as you get close to the edge, it's not as even. So what's the zone where the temperature is even? That's what we call the sweet spot, and that's in this funny cone-shaped area. Here's our hamburger cutaway. We have a recipe for the ultimate burger. When we had to delay the book at one point, the New York Times ran a story with the title, "The wait for the 40-hour burger just got longer." Because if you make every element of this, including the bun and so forth, it takes 40 hours. Now, not 40 hours of your time. The dough has to proof for a long period of time and so forth. But one of our philosophies is that any food is worthy of being elevated to a high level of sophistication. It's not just a fancy food. It's not just a particular ethnicity. So if you really want the ultimate hamburger, you can make it. And obviously the ultimate hamburger takes more time and effort than the run-of-the-mill ordinary one. So we explain how to cook the bun. Here's how to grind the meat. Turns out that actually matters. What you want in a... one other point. When I say the ultimate hamburger, of course that's a very personal thing. People have their own concepts, particularly of an iconic comfort food dish like a hamburger. So when I say perfect, I don't mean it's everybody's, but we thought we'd have ours. You want the patty to stick together, but you don't want it to stick together so much that it's rubbery. And there's a fundamental thing about sandwich physics that comes into this. I'm going to set this down. If you pull the sandwich away from your face and something slides out, that's a bad thing. So that's why the meat in a sandwich has to be very tender or has to have been sliced very thin, because otherwise you pull away and you're holding onto the bread and you leave this piece of meat out there. So sandwich physics dictates that you want it to be fairly loose. Well, the way you actually can achieve this is as the meat comes out of the grinder, you try to align all of the grains. And then you don't squish it too much when you put it together. And if you do that, it sticks together just enough that you've got a burger, but not so much that it becomes sort of rubbery. We've got a lot of stuff on new techniques. This is from our chapter on sous vide cooking. Sous vide is a technique that's been around since the earliest things in the 1970s and has become very prominent in the last few years in high-end restaurants. So we explain how to do it, including how to do it in the very simplified ways. You know, this is an improvised sous vide thing where there's a company that sells these controllers for about $100 and you connect it up to a rice cooker and you've got a sous vide outfit. Or you can go even simpler than that. You can just take actually Ziploc bags. Ordinary plastic bags work. You don't really need to seal them. You just need to keep the open end out so clothespins work really well. So we tried to run the full gamut of things that includes, some of our book does include exotic equipment. And in doing that, by the way, we break a rule of cookbooks, which is many people think cookbooks have to be written to the lowest common denominator. Or, perhaps I'll betray my prejudice, they have to be dumbed down. And we had a fundamental rule that said we're never going to dumb the book down. We'll make it as accessible as possible, but realistically, not every single recipe is for every single person. And that if we have people that are passionate and curious about food, even if they don't do a very exotic recipe, a recipe that only Heston Blumenthal or Ferran Adria might attempt, it's still kind of cool that they have all the steps and they understand, at least at some level, how Heston or Ferran or some chef of that caliber would approach it. This is from the sous vide thing. Here's we're showing why you cook sous vide. You want to get edge to edge done as opposed to that. This is more of an interesting point. There's no single right way to cook food. That's another thing that we feel very strongly about. This is a short rib of beef here. And short rib can be cooked many, many ways. The traditional braise is over here, 82C for 10 hours. And if you want the flaking, falling apart texture, which is a wonderful aspect of a traditional braise, that's how you should cook it. If you cook it at 55C for 48 hours, it winds up having the incredible beefy flavor of a short rib, but it's got a texture that's more like a tender steak. There's no right way to cook this. There's a whole spectrum of ways to cook it, and our job isn't to tell people this is how you should cook or how you should eat. It's to say, look, if you want this texture, which is absolutely appropriate for some things, here's how you achieve it. You want that one, that's how you achieve it. And in fact, that's what this table does. You won't be able to see all of the table here, but we have, this is tough cuts, and here we have times, both sous vide times and pressure cooking times. Pressure cooking is a technique that we love and we use in a variety of ways. Because if you want the meat to be highly cooked and you don't have the 10 hours, a pressure cooker will give it to you a lot faster. We also use a pressure cooker for stocks. This is one of our cutaway photos that shows making a stock in a pressure cooker. Now in this case, this was not actually under pressure when we took the picture, but there's an interesting thing most people don't know. In a properly set up pressure cooker, it's not bubbling inside. Because if you just bring the pressure up just to the edge, if you've got one of those jiggling weight pressure cookers, there will be a little bubbling. But in a modern spring-operated one like this is a Fagor, I think, but there's Kuhnrick and there's many brands. If it just comes up, the water's actually still inside. It's hot. It's hotter than boiling point normally. It's maybe 120 degrees C. And that still hot water does a terrific job of extracting flavors. So for most stocks, that's how we like to make them. But a pressure cooker can also do some other amazing things. This is one of the recipes in the book that's maybe one of the simplest recipes in the book. And it's about trying to get a caramelized flavor with vegetables, in this case carrots. And I've got a video that actually shows how this works. So we start with some nice carrots. We cut them up, and nothing very unusual here. We do core the carrots because the core is actually far more bitter than the outside. And the way we like this particular soup, you do it without that. So here we're putting some butter into the pressure cooker. We're adding our carrots. Stirring around, nothing particularly special. Then we're going to add one special ingredient. But a special ingredient almost everybody has in the kitchen. We're going to add some baking soda. And it's about 0.5% baking soda by weight of the carrots. And what the baking soda does is it makes it alkaline. And the chemical reactions also caramelization happen at a lower temperature when that occurs. So now we're going to seal up the pressure cooker. We didn't put any liquid in. That's key. No liquid. We bring the pressure cooker up to pressure. And 20 minutes later, we open the pressure cooker up and look at my carrots. Okay? The carrots have caramelized, and I wish we'd actually cut one in half. All the way through they're that color. It's not just on the surface. And that's because we created the temperature of the pressure cooker and the alkalinity. So then to make a soup, we just puree it, typically with water or maybe a little bit of fresh carrot juice to add a fresh carrot flavor. And then here we're going to serve it with this is a savory coconut foam, and we have some Indian spices going on. We make very similar soups with all kinds of other vegetables. It works with eggplant, it works with squash, many kinds. Now, a lot of cookbooks, a lot of books on the science of cooking emphasize chemistry. Here's a cool chemistry example. The things responsible for the color of red cabbage change the color changes depending on the acidity or alkalinity just like litmus paper does. And so in fact, we juiced a bunch of cabbages, and this is all cabbage juice down here. And the only difference is we'd either add some baking soda or something else that's very basic over on the basic side, this is the alkaline side, or we'd add some acid. And depending on the pH, you wind up getting a different color. Here's a quince that shows a color change that's a function of temperature. So similar idea, but instead of it being the pH, it's how hot you've made it. We have a bunch of our chapters talk about modernist techniques. You know, Ferran Adri is famous for his modernist gels. But when I came to write the gel chapter, we realized, you know, tofu is a gel. Cheese is a gel. We couldn't cover all the cheese making, but we did cover a lot of fresh cheese making. So we have recipes for our own tofu, for mozzarella, for ricotta. We've got a huge section on fruit. Here's one of the more interesting things. This is an example of something that came from academic food research that somehow hasn't bubbled out to the general public. If you want a lot of fresh fruits, like say blueberries, to stay longer, well, believe it or not, you should plunge them into very hot water when you get them. We have a little table here for the different things. For blueberries, it's the first column, 60 C water, 140 degrees. Now, all your intuition would say if you plunge your blueberries in hot water, you're going to make jam out of them. I mean, they're going to fall apart. It's going to absolutely doesn't do that. You put them in there for a short period of time, just a few minutes. You take them out, and they stay much crisper and much longer. Because what you've done is you've actually killed a bunch of the molds on the outside, which is the primary reason that they age. And we did a bunch of experiments. We picked 60C because when you take it up to 60C, that's enough. Oddly enough, lettuce, you can do this too. You don't take it quite so high, maybe about 40C. And oddly enough, a quick heat shock gives you fresher, crisper fruits and vegetables for longer. We have tons of information on this. This is about making an apple cider consommé, where we're using an enzyme here to clarify it. You can see how clear it gets. Here's a cutaway that's showing how a cream whipper works. So we cut one of those in half. This is that chapter on wine. Now, I mentioned earlier that you need to, when you actually when you do these photos, you often make a hell of a mess. To get this wonderful photo, we had a lot of trials, and most of them came out like this, actually. It took about a case of wine glasses before we got the shot that we wanted. This is the hyper-decanting thing that we previously talked about. You know, one of the things that was interesting is that we had help from people all over the world. Sometimes when I say it was, we wanted to pull all this data from all kinds of restaurants, people say, oh, well, the chefs must have been secretive. And oddly, the opposite was true. The chefs that we work with, whether it was Heston or Ferran or Joan Roca, the scientists like Harold McGee, they couldn't have been more open. The reason that their ideas weren't more widely shared wasn't that they were trying to be possessive of them. It's that they didn't have the time or the energy or the money to make a book like this. I'm sometimes asked how come I wrote the book, because I'm not a restaurant chef. And I always laugh and I say, hey, if I ran a restaurant, I never would have had time to do this. And so here's a high-speed video. Watch down here. This is a man's thumb. He's pulling it off of a champagne cork, and watch the cork here. So that's what I have for a prepared presentation. I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'm going to walk around with this mic, and anyone who has a question to ask, please do so. Before you ask your question, if you could just say who you are, say your name, please. And since I have the mic, I'm going to hog it for a moment. Nathan, one of the most for me, one of the most fascinating parts of your book is your discussion of food safety, especially as it applies to meat and poultry. I wonder whether you could spend a couple of minutes talking about that, explaining it.
So, you know, one of the reasons the book is so big is that whenever I would find some loose end, I'd tug on it, and it's like tugging on a loose thread on your sweater. You might unravel the whole thing, and that caused more things to happen. So while working on sous vide, of course, there's been a lot of concern about health and food safety with sous vide, and understandably so. But as I thought, well, boy, I better do a food safety chapter. But then, to do food safety, you really realize that there's two parts to food safety. There's microbiology. For example, most people don't know why it's called food poisoning, even though it's about germs. Isn't germs about infection? Well, it turns out there's two very different things that go on. There are some things that you catch that are an infection. A good example is norovirus. Norovirus is a virus which the only way for you to get it is to get a particle that came from another person's gut. You can imagine how that happens. But I'll tell you, even more than that, it's called the fecal oral route. You shouldn't eat other people's feces. You'd think you wouldn't have to point that out. But in fact, it's actually remarkably easy to do that. As an example, the fat duck was closed down for a while with a incident which came from infection of norovirus, which was traced to 2 shellfish suppliers that they had. So an oyster sits there all day long pumping water through it. And in fact, they pump about 20 liters of water per oyster per day. And they filter out any little particles in there. So unfortunately, if there's untreated sewage going into the water, they may filter it out. And it doesn't take very much. Just tiny amounts can affect hundreds of square miles of oyster beds. And so that's why you sometimes get an issue. Food poisoning, by the way, is something totally different. There are some bacteria that will produce a toxin. And so what happens is if you leave the food out at too high a temperature, they grow, they make the toxin. It's the toxin that makes you sick, not the bugs. And so they're actually 2 very different modalities. So we had to explain all of that. But then we discovered that in fact a lot of the food safety things that people are taught are just flat wrong. And that they're wrong for 2 reasons. The first is that some well-meaning people once upon a time decided that they would be sort of paternalistic and condescending, and that the consumer couldn't understand that it requires a time and a temperature to kill a bug, but it does. So if you have pathogens, in order to make the food safe, you have to have a particular temperature for a particular period of time. But somewhere, someone decided that's too complicated, we should just give them a temperature. Which is actually wrong, but it is what got done. Well, then you get people also saying, well, gee, let's add a safety factor, and let's add a safety factor with the safety factor. So we really got into this. I went through the Food and Drug Administration of the United States has something called the Food Code, which is this giant, thick, literally that thick if you print it out thing. And we went through it very carefully. We found at least half a dozen errors in the Food Code. Some of them were errors in the direction of being insanely overcautious. Some were in the direction of being unsafe. And so I went to Washington, D.C., and I met with them. It turns out they're not really keen on people doing this. They don't really want people to find their errors. But so we've written a food safety chapter that sort of explains all of the scientific facts about food safety. And some of those things wind up being quite different than people are taught ordinarily. I mean, as an example, it's very hard to, in my view, cook fish properly and have fish actually be completely safe. Which means if you're cooking in a hospital, you probably shouldn't be cooking fish because you're going to have to cook it beyond all recognition. Pork is an interesting thing. Most people believe you have to cook pork to death. In fact, if you actually look at the US regulations, there's no higher requirement for pork than for beef. But lots of food writers, even the US Pork Council, this marketing thing for pork, sort of said, oh, you have to cook it to 175 degrees. In fact, that's 175 Fahrenheit. In fact, it's safe as long as you keep it there for enough time at 55°C or 130 degrees, and it's way juicier. So we found lots of interesting things like that. Now, it's also an example of the book having stuff that really isn't in a typical cookbook. And our philosophy was, hey, let's put that stuff in there because some people will find it interesting, and other people might say, ah, that fecal oral thing, that's not for me, I'm going to skip over that section. But it's there if you need it, and I think if you really want people to understand, and chefs to understand, what really makes things safe or unsafe. I mean, another great example of a myth like this is most people think that meat and poultry is fundamentally more dangerous than other products. Well, the blunt truth is almost all of what you're worried about is human excrement. And human excrement can get on things regardless. And if it's not human, then it's an animal's excrement. And right now in the United States, there is, I think, 21 people have died so far from an outbreak on cantaloupe. Previous things have been on peanut butter, spinach, strawberries. In fact, it's not about something intrinsically in the food. Like, oh, that food is sort of intrinsically dirty, and so I have to worry about it. There may be a few things like that, but by and large, it's about contamination. And it's about a food chain that is unfortunately not robust enough against contamination. Anyway, that was a long-winded question. May I answer your question?
Oh, not as far as I'm concerned. Anyone else with a question?
Yes?
If you want to speak up. Oh, John.
In sous vide, is there a problem of balancing the length of time and the temperature that is ideal for flavor against what is necessary to kill contamination?
Yes, there is a balance there, but it depends an awful lot on what you're trying to achieve. With fish, most fish, to my taste, I would cook it to 45°C, 113 Fahrenheit. Now that's like a hot bath. And if your fish is fresh and you've got good hygiene, there isn't any problem with that. It's like eating warm sushi, basically. For the same reason sushi doesn't kill people in droves, this won't. Now, if it's really low quality fish, I'd personally rather not cook it. For other things, there's no so there, if you cooked it long enough to actually pasteurize the fish, so it was completely pasteurized, you would have to cook it for long enough that to my taste, the fish would be overcooked. There may be some preparations where you want that texture, in which case go right ahead. Also, it will depend a lot on the individual fish. For other things, for the short ribs, where I was saying 55°C for 48 hours, in that case, the long period of time, the longer you cook it, actually, the safer it gets in some sense. Our longest recipe in the book is for an oxtail thing that goes for 100 hours. So you don't come home and say, hey honey, let's have oxtail. You kind of have to plan in advance, but it's really quite magical after 100 hours. Yes?
Hi, my name's Rowan. I'm a science teacher. Also, I teach cooking lessons. I'm going to set up my own cooking business. So, what I'm doing. I'm here today actually because I saw your TED talk. So, I wouldn't have heard about you had it not been for the TED talk. I've met Harold McGee. Anyway, so when it comes to my passions, I'm passionate about science and about food. So, this is right up my street, and it was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. In particular, I'm passionate about spices. And I wonder, this might be a suggestion, whether or not you could do a second edition, maybe not 5 volumes, for spices. Because when it comes to spices, you've got so many different spices, so many different flavours. You've got the chemistry there, you know, eugenol is the component in cloves, for example, of those cloves, and so on. So would you consider doing a second edition with spices?
We'll put it on the list. You know, having just come up for air after 5 years of working on this, we're trying to decide carefully before we go into our next big project. We don't treat, except for a few exceptions, we don't treat pastry, baking, or dessert in this book. So that is kind of an obvious thing for us to do in a follow-on book. You're right, spices are fascinating and complex. We've got, in our bibliography, we list a whole bunch of books that take it in a lot of detail. A few things we talk about capsaicins, for example, that's the ingredient in chili peppers. I'll just tell you a funny story about this. Someone at the University of Washington, near where we're located, actually figured out why capsaicins exist. See, fruit is a bribe for animals to carry seeds. And a fruit being sweet is something to encourage animals to eat it, and by eating it, they will distribute those seeds. So it's kind of taxi fare for the seeds. So why would you make something in your fruit that makes you think your mouth's on fire? That it's even used as a repellent. I mean, it's to scare grizzly bears away, you spray these chili pepper in their face. What's up with that? So this guy at University of Washington did a whole bunch of studying, and he discovered a fascinating thing. Birds lack the receptor to taste capsaicin. So the point of capsaicin was a mammal repellent. Birds think chilies are sweet. They eat the chilies, they distribute this, and for some evolutionary reason, the chili said, you know, those mammals, they aren't doing a good enough job, we have to specialize. But we don't comprehensively cover spices and flavor, so that would have to be another book for us or somebody else.
Michelle Berridale Johnson, did you do any work in the process of looking at these various cooking techniques on what it did to the nutritional content of the food that you were cooking?
We did to some degree. Now, there's a couple aspects of the nutritional thing in foods. And of course, depending on the food, you have a different goal. So here's an amusing story. If you take carrots, and you eat carrots because you'd like to get the beta carotene, the efficiency is roughly 5%. 5% of the beta carotene in the carrot is going to wind up in you. If you juice it, it goes up to 13%. And I won't bore you with all of the statistics in between, but if you saute it in butter for a long period of time, it's about 70%. So it's wonderful how some things turn out. That's one example. Of course, an interesting thing about our modern society is, with the exception of a few things like beta carotene and so forth, our problem isn't too little nutrition, it's too much. And so we also discuss some things about sort of the epidemic of obesity around the world. Most people in most Western parts of the Western developed world are suffering from too much nutrition, not too little. Too little of some kinds, of course, but broadly, it's kind of a different problem. And people eating very high-end food, particularly, that's not an issue. But we do discuss some of those things. We also have let me expand on that also. We also have what will be a very controversial chapter called Food and Health, which takes a little broader view. I had a lot of people say, hey, you cook with all of these weird ingredients, and aren't those weird chemicals? Isn't your food chock full of chemicals? I'd say, yes, in fact, it's even more full of elements. Because, of course, everything is a chemical if you get down to it. The fact that there are herbs that mimic drugs are because they have active ingredients. And those things that are in, the wonderful flavors are one attribute of that, but of course there's plants that are toxic and there's plants that are good for you. So we put a lot of effort into saying, well, let's really examine all of these modernist ingredients and see what the evidence is. But then I had someone say, okay, fine, I got you. You're not going to kill me with the xanthan gum. So xanthan gum is a product of bacterial fermentation, almost exactly like vinegar is. So if you don't like that, you shouldn't be eating vinegar. They said, okay, but you're going to kill people with foie gras and bacon, and you've got lots of fatty foods in there. Isn't that horrible of you that you're doing that? So we rolled up our sleeves and we looked at all of the best available scientific evidence about the impact of, say, saturated fats, animal fats or dairy fats, on cancer and heart disease and other things. And we were surprised to discover that most of the common knowledge, even among medical doctors and nutritionists, just has no scientific support. So in fact, there is no good statistical link between consumption of animal fats and either heart disease or cancer. There is no link between consuming fiber in colon cancer. It was a charming story. Actually, we tell the whole story of that particular one. Someone had an idea that in fact fiber was beneficial for this, but it took many, many years before it was tested in definitive studies, and the definitive studies show it has no effect. So there's a lot of things, there are some things that do have an effect. Here's a tragic example. There's a large health study in the United States called the Nurses Study. This followed the health of 86,000 nurses for about 30 years. And at that time, nurses were mostly female, and these were all women. They were all female. Well, one group were the margarine eaters. This study started in the late 1960s. In the late 1960s, one of the reasons to eat margarine is it's polyunsaturated. There's another group that were the butter eaters. And of course, everyone knew the margarine eaters were eating this for their health. And their cardiac death rate is 4 times that of the butter eaters. Because the margarine in that era was trans fats, and trans fats are one of those things, well, actually they're right, they are bad for you. Trans fats are where they take an oil, a vegetable oil, which doesn't want to be solid at room temperature. And they mess with it chemically so that it will be solid at room temperature, so you can make margarine out of it, so it'd be sort of like butter. And some very well-meaning people guessing that polyunsaturated fats ought to, in their theory, be better for you than saturated fats, actually killed a lot of folks by recommending that they eat this stuff. Now, it's a very controversial area. We try to position it appropriately and say, look, we're not taking a stand on this other than to say, here's what the best available scientific evidence is today. We have these little sidebars in the book to say, here's how you can read one of those press releases when the study comes out. Here's some of the weasel words to look for so you can get some idea of what's going on. But a lot of people on the team said, why pick a fight with this? It's almost like a religion. And I finally said, well, if I tell food lovers bacon isn't so bad after all, how mad are they going to be at me? Next question.
Hi, my name is Bea Wilson. I'm a food writer and historian. Thank you for a fascinating talk and many congratulations on the book. Although I am a curious and passionate person about food, I haven't, alas, got my own copy yet because I'm saving up to buy one. But I was very fortunate to be given brief online access to it, and I learnt something on every page, not that I've read every page. And the stuff on techniques in particular was fascinating. But something, I may have just missed this because, as I say, I haven't read every section. In many, many respects, the photography is just out of this world extraordinary. It is indeed, as you've been telling us, I think, unlike any book that's ever appeared or probably ever will appear. But in one way, it seemed to me curiously old-fashioned and a little bit like a return to the old gastronomy after the kind of food ethics books that we've seen from people like Michael Pollan and Eric Schlosser. I noticed you talked a little bit about the food system in relation to food poisoning of cantaloupes and spinach and so on. Is that a subject which just seemed beyond the remit of this particular book, or are there sections I've missed, or is it something which doesn't interest you very much?
So we actually cover, I won't claim to comprehensively cover it as much as Schlosser or Pollan do, but we do touch on several aspects of it. In our meat chapter, we have a big section on humane treatment of meat. We have, throughout the book, we have biographies of people. We have, for example, everyone knows that your kitchen appliances consume watts. Well, we have a biography of James Watt, because we want to explain where that came from. We have a biography of a woman named Temple Grandin, who is a fantastic story. She's autistic. She has a PhD in a doctor of veterinary medicine. She was instrumental in humane slaughter methods in the United States. Humane slaughter matters to us, not on a moral issue as much as it really does make the meat taste better, because if your animals are terrified and tortured before they're actually slaughtered, it actually has a huge impact on the meat. We have all these photographs and so forth. So there's an example of a topic that we handle that way. We have another part of the book we discuss organic and local food. That's another one that will be slightly controversial because, at least in the United States, what organic used to mean is it was this heirloom variety stuff grown by that hippie couple just outside of town, and you know, the apples would be a little bit misshapen, but wow, they tasted great. But as organic got to be big business, it became something that there was a bunch of government regulations. An amusing part of the government regulations is they had a set of chemicals that it was okay to add to organic food. But there's this great part of the law. It says, but it's expected that within a few years all of these will be phased out. It's just a transitionary thing. Well, since that period of time, nothing has gone off the list, and 200 additional things have been put on the list. Organic is now done in giant industrial volume by places like Walmart. You don't have them here, I don't think, but don't worry about that. You don't need them. So, in fact, organic is a slogan that has been almost completely hollowed out by people using it as a marketing slogan and taking all of the things it used to mean and making sure it doesn't mean any of them anymore because they discovered they get to charge a premium price for the thing. So that's one where we say, hey, organic might have meant something, but in fact, typically, at least in the United States, it doesn't. So, you know, buyer beware, not all these things actually are as they say they are. I love Michael Pollan's books, but one of the things we point out, he's got this interesting proposition that you shouldn't eat anything your great-grandmother didn't eat. So we have a little short section where we discuss how many great-grandmothers ago all of the food we eat came from. Okay, so if you like tomatoes, that was like two to three great-grandmothers ago. If you like chocolate, I mean, you sort of go down this whole list of things. Of course, it is a natural reaction that people have to new things in their food. He's absolutely right to be skeptical. He actually came over to our lab, and we gave him a tour of the lab. We cooked lunch for him. We get along great. But it's a little too simplistic to say don't eat what great-grandma ate, because throughout all of history, we've had enormous innovations in food. You know, thank God that Italians finally got tomatoes. Now, an interesting thing is, tomatoes were not universally accepted in Europe when they were brought back. In fact, the country that accepted them last in southern Europe was Italy, and the place in Italy that accepted it last was Tuscany. And the reason why? People thought they were poisonous. The idea that new foods might be secretly bad for you and unhealthy, that idea is 500 years old at least. And, by the way, the same folks that were skeptical of tomatoes, they accepted tobacco like that. As soon as the Spanish brought it back, everybody in Europe was smoking. So it just goes to show you have to be very careful about what things you choose to be skeptical of. So we don't have a comprehensive view of all of that, but I think piece by piece, if you look through it, you'll find a bunch of stuff that's relevant. Yes?
It's Alex Renton, I'm a food writer. Two questions. One, in your health chapter, did you address sugar, the great scarce subject? And secondly, the caramelized carrots recipe, you didn't tell us what pressure they had to be at.
Okay, so I'll answer the first one and the second one. So the pressure is just the high pressure setting, which is usually 1 bar, 15 psi, roughly. And if you look about sort of modernist cuisine carrot soup, you'll find lots of people online that have been making it and posting all of their experiences. So I've reduced the reason for you to buy my book, but oh well. In terms of sugar, we don't comprehensively treat sugar, except to say sugar is another one of these things that has gone through a very similar pathway to these other modernist ingredients. Sugar was once upon a time something you bought in an apothecary store. Very much like you might buy xanthan gum or some of these other more exotic ingredients. And it wasn't until people came up with an industrial way of creating refined white sugar that it exists in the quantities that it did. Many food scientists believe that if you subjected sucrose, ordinary sugar, to the same set of rigorous testing that's done of any new thing, it probably wouldn't pass. Because it rots your teeth, it has a variety of other things that are very clear direct benefits. We also discuss a little bit the hysteria around high fructose corn syrup, which is, of course, sugar. It's not exactly the same as sucrose, but it's designed so that it metabolizes almost immediately in your body to create exactly the same things in sucrose, because it was trying to be a cheap substitute for sugar. And if you eat either one of those things in huge quantities, you're going to have a problem. The idea that one of them is radically worse or better for you than another is quite unsupported. Same thing with honey. You know, honey is pure fructose. In fact, we found an interesting thing. There are honey companies that are doing the following twisted thing to get around this whole organic, people are afraid of their food things. It turns out you can take high fructose corn syrup, put it into little feeders, kind of like hummingbird feeders, get bees to suck on it, and it's like money laundering. You turn it into clean, natural honey. The bees love it because it's full of fructose, of course. So it's like, hey, this is great. The bees are like thrilled. Now, does that make that honey like remarkably better for you than the of course not. It's the same thing with some bee spit put into it. In fact, you're lucky if it's just the spit. But so that's an example of something where, yeah, we treat it to some degree. Salt is another thing that's an even more controversial area. But salt is one of the things that we cover in that chapter. So, yeah?
It's Reiko Hara, and I'm chef, lecturer, and author.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just, because I come from the different Oriental cooking, therefore Oriental cooking has a lot of marinating,
Yes.
which affects the cooking time. Have
Yep.
you discussed that in your book?
We absolutely have. we have a subchapter on brine. We have another subchapter on marinades. We discuss both alkaline and acid marinades. Most Asian marinades are actually alkaline. And it happens that one of our chefs, Johnny Zhu, is Chinese by ancestry. He's an American. So he managed to get a lot of Chinese things into our book. Another one of our cooks is Indian, so we have a lot of Indian food in the book because of Anjana. And then we have a lot of Japanese food because we like it. So we can't comprehensively cover every cuisine in the world, of course. But we wanted to hit on some of these highlights. So we have Nung Bao chicken recipe, because in fact that's typically made with an alkaline marinade, and there's a specific reason you do that. We have several other recipes to specifically illustrate those points. Yes?
I love the example of the wine in the blender. It's one of those things when you go to restaurants that sommeliers or inexperienced sommeliers refuse to decant young wine.
Yeah.
What was the most fun snobism that you smashed in this book?
Well, that's certainly one of them. The idea of doing wine that way. I tell a great story of. I went to chef school in France once upon a time, and we had a segment of the thing was in. The school was in Burgundy, so they took all of the students around Burgundy, and we had this wine expert lecture to us about wine and all about the terroir, and how the soil was everything in the wine, and why if you even go a few meters, the soil would change differently. And I was sort of the obnoxious American in the group. It's something my country does well. I said, so how come all these great vineyards, how come the fields are rectangles? The guy said, what do you mean? I said, well, you said it's in the soil. And you said even a few meters makes a difference. So how come Clos de Vougeot is a rectangle? And he didn't have a good answer to that. Turns out nobody has a good answer to that. When it really comes down to it, yes, there's a certain amount of stuff which clearly is related to soil and microclimate and so forth. But a lot of it is nowhere near as precise as people possibly could make it out to be. We also have a set of things in that wine section where we describe experiments that various perceptual scientists have done, where they do things like you take white wine and you put tasteless food coloring in, you dye it red, and you give it to wine experts, and they rate it as a red wine. Nobody notices that it's really a white wine. We describe, another part of the book, we describe how to do your own taste tests. It's a fascinating thing when the best way to do it if you have two things is something called the triangle test. So you have 3 samples, which are labeled, of 2 things. So that means one of them is repeated. And so the question is, can you tell which one's different? And it turns out if you can't tell which one's different, then there's no difference. Or obviously you'll guess a certain point randomly, you could guess which one was different, but then you collect some statistics. An interesting experiment we did like that is we were trying to understand the technique of confit. It's when you cook a duck legs or other meat in fat for a long period of time. And any chef will tell you that when you make confit, that there's a unique texture and taste that you get from cooking all that long time in the oil or the fat, and the fat's essential. So I was trying to figure out how that could be. I decided it couldn't be. There's no way that this could work because the lipid molecules, the fats, are really big, and they can't go through the membranes. And if they could go through the membranes, I'd leak. Okay? My membranes are holding my fat in. So how's that work? So we did a bunch of experiments where we took duck legs and we took pork, we did some other meats, and we would cook them both in a traditional way under fat. We'd cook them sous vide, and we'd steam them. And then we'd serve them, sort of in a uniform way. We couldn't tell better than random. Now you tell the traditional French chef that, and say, well, I don't agree. And I would say, agree isn't the issue. Have you tried it? It's an experiment. And if you've tried a random taste test and you can taste it and I can't, well, my hat's off to you. But a lot of things in cooking, you need to do that experiment.
We have time for only one more question, I'm afraid. Who wants to be the bold one to stand up and ask? So, who's been over there? Yeah.
Mine's a little bit frivolous. I was at my friend's house yesterday and we hyper-decanted some wine. And we got into quite a big argument about how long we should do it for. And obviously you seem the best person to ask. And how do you go about working out that, given that wine taste is quite a sort of personal thing?
Well, it is personal, and there's no rule for that. We usually do it for about 30 seconds,
okay.
But I can't say that that's deeply scientific. Now, we've tried a bunch of variations, kind of given who we are, so we've tried it by taking pure nitrogen and putting it in at the same time, or pure oxygen. Because we wanted to see, is it really more oxidation that's causing it, or is it more outgassing? It seems to be more outgassing. There's not that much difference between pure nitrogen and pure oxygen, although there could be some other explanations of that. And I don't guarantee it always works, okay? And taste is very personal. One of the things that I never want to do is tell people this is the one right way to do it. In fact, a lot of the book is about debunking the notion that there's a single right way to do it. So that said, most young red wines, the same wines you'd want to decant, will benefit from it. And they'll get much smoother much more quickly. And I wouldn't hyper-decant it and leave it for a week. That's not going to, because ultimately you'll overdo it. So unfortunately you have to experiment.
This could go on all evening, I suspect, but our guest cannot go on all evening. No more questions, I'm afraid. So can you please just thank once again our wonderful